Let's bring Dr. Hugh Ross on stage again. Dr. Ross, have a seat. And we're just gonna fire away, and then we'll have some questions that, if you wanna text any question, 32898, and we'll bring the questions out. Here's a question that we had in the last service that I thought was a good one. Dr. Ross, what is the most compelling piece of evidence for someone to become a Christian?
Well, as I said in the first service, that most compelling evidence is given to us by the Apostle Paul, the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The very fact that we got an empty tomb. And if the enemies of Christianity had the body, they would have produced it. And so the historical evidence for that empty tomb, I would say, is the strongest evidence that the Christian faith is correct.
Excellent. Again, I'm just gonna just throw these questions out quick. What's the biggest hurdle, Dr. Ross, or obstacle in keeping someone from accepting Christ? I know you debate many atheists, Nobel Prize winners, brilliant people, blah, 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 blah. What would you say their biggest hurdle is, their biggest obstacle?
Well, the biggest hurdle of getting people even to listen to the historical evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead are their intellectual objections. Excuse me. That's why I focused on Genesis 1 this morning.
Right.
Because of all the chapters in the Bible, that's the one that gets the greatest amount of mockery and ridicule. And so if you can help people pass their objections, their scientific objections to Genesis 1, you'll gain the right to talk to them about the evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Answer their questions first before you present your evidence.
Isn't that great? You said also last night, Dr. Ross, that you are still a skeptic. You're a follower of Christ, yet you still are a skeptic. Talk to us about that. Talk to me about that, why you are a skeptic, and why is it important for us to continue to engage and ask questions?
Well, that's the command that we see in Thessalonians. Test everything, hold fast to that which is good. So basically what the Bible tells us, never stop putting things to the test. Now, there's a difference between a skeptic and a cynic. A skeptic tests things, and if they prove to be correct, he says, okay, I'm going to accept that and believe it. A cynic says, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, I'm not going to believe it. And so the Bible,
that right there, I want you to say that one more time. I love that. Say it again, a skeptic, the difference between a skeptic and a cynic.
Well, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I spoke at an auditorium that was sponsored by Atheists United. 300 atheists, and I discovered they weren't that united. Before I spoke, I said, let me ask a question of all of you. If you see incontrovertible evidence that God does exist, will you submit to that God? A third of them raised their hand and said, yes. If I can see adequate evidence that indeed is correct, then I will follow God. 2/3 of them said, it doesn't matter how much evidence you give me, I still refuse to believe. That's the cynic. Audience number one, that's the skeptic. They said, we haven't seen that evidence. If you can provide it, we're ready. And by the way, we had a huge response that evening. I mean, our table was crowded by that 1/3 who really wanted to see this evidence.
Yes. Isn't that interesting, too, that he mentioned a third? Because, Dr. Ross, last week, I did a series about the church. I said the church is the table with 3 chairs around it where people come to get fed, the bread of life, John 6:35. I said the first chair should be full of skeptics, people who have not stepped over the line yet. And I believe, like you said last night, the deepest thinking people are those who engage the skeptic.
That's correct. I mean, also we need to realize that often the skeptic seeker is going to be most belligerent and most aggressive just before they cross the line. Why? Because they're role-playing the kind of response they're going to get from their friends and associates if they become a Christian.
Whoa.
And so they want to see how you, the Christian, can respond to what they're going to face. And so I look at that as a sign that they're really close to giving their life to Jesus Christ.
I believe that. And I've never heard anyone say that. Of course, I've never talked to anyone as brilliant as you either, but I can see that in many different circumstances and situations through the years, and I think those of us who've been at fellowship for a while. So I just love that. And that's why it's so important, and I love what you do, to engage the culture. Talk to us about how you engage people who have questions, because you personally do it, and you do it when you speak. And
well, it tells us in 1 Peter, always be ready with good reasons for the hope within you. And that includes making sure you've got good reasons for the questions that the people you're engaging. And so what we do at Reasons to Believe is we talk to all kinds of different unbelievers to find out what their questions and issues are so we can prepare the appropriate reasons. But also notice it says in the second half of 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give good reasons for the hope within you with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience. And so your demeanor is actually more important than what kind of evidences you have.
That is so true. And that's what I love about you, Dr. Ross, is your demeanor. You're unflappable. Obviously, I can see Jesus all over you, and people see that, respond to it. And that's been our prayer during this entire series, and we want to have you back very soon to even get deeper in this. But as we talk about today, God and science, already, just what I've seen online, the comments, questions, people are just going, wow, this is unbelievable. As we talk about government, God and government, we're going to do it in a very kind way, respectful way. As I talk about religions, next week, you kind of touched on it. You kind of set me up about Islam and Buddhism, etc. As we talked about sexuality, we're going to do it in a very loving way. So I think that is the key. And that brings me to another question. This is from last night. We're going to bring out some more right now. Where does evidence stop and faith begin? Thank you, Hope. Okay, for example, Dr. Ross is a genius, brilliant. Okay, he stacked up all this evidence, right, for the existence of God, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Where does that stop, and where does faith fit in with that, Dr. Ross?
Well, I often run into atheists who say, I will not believe until we know everything we can know about this subject. When all the gaps are closed, then I'll believe. And I say, wait a minute, there's always going to be gaps. We're never going to know everything. And I can't give you the absolute proof for God that you're demanding, because we human beings are constrained to the space-time realm of the universe. I tell them, for example, that in spite of being married for 37 years to my wife, I still lack absolute proof that she exists. All I have is a lot of scientific evidence that she exists. However, I can tell you this, I got more evidence for existence today thanks to many experiments and observations than I had 37 years ago. Yes. And it's like that with God. I don't have absolute proof for God's existence, but I have enough evidence that I'm prepared to extrapolate. And that's where, quote, the evidence ends and the faith begins. You say, I've got enough evidence here that I'm prepared to trust God in those areas where I lack understanding and knowledge, and confident that I'm going to get more knowledge and understanding that's going to verify that extrapolation.
Dr. Ross, how would you encourage someone here, thousands and thousands of people are experiencing this, to step over that line? I know we cannot force someone to step over the line, but do you just tell people, okay, here's the evidence, it's time just to step out, it's just time to risk it? How do you,
there comes a point where the evidence historically and scientifically is more than adequate, but what that will often do is expose some heart reasons for why they're resistant. For example, I came to a point after 18 months where I said, the evidence is more than adequate. But I knew what I was going to face if I started sharing my Christian experience with students and professors at the University of British Columbia. And so I was fearful to sign my name in the back of that Gideon Bible, realizing what I was stepping into. But then I recognized, thanks to the Gideons, that when you give your life to Christ, the Holy Spirit will come into you and give you new power and new desires you never had before. And I recognize if I make this commitment, when I share my faith, because that's one thing I recognize, giving your life to Jesus Christ means being a public witness for Him. But you don't go alone. And so literally within days after I signed my name in the back of the Gideon Bible, my lab partner and best friend, John Sampson, who was the chairman of the physics department at the University of Alberta, he's just passed away, but he came up to me and says, Hugh, I've been going through struggles in my life. I need to talk to somebody about God. You know anybody in this campus that knows anything about God? And so we talked for 4 hours that afternoon. And I realized God's in the business of going with you to pave the way.
That's right.
You don't go alone.
What a great word. Hugh, I've always said too, it's sort of like you're in an airplane, and many of us have been on airplanes where, you know, due to weather or whatever, you can't land and the plane begins to circle. But after a while, you have to land the plane. So sometimes we deal with people, and it's just this cynical circle, I guess you could say, isn't it? And they never land the plane because it behooves them to just circle as opposed to...
One thing, it tells us in the book of Matthew that if we will not forgive others, then God will not forgive us. And we have to come to a point where we realize what God did for us on the cross, he suffered far more than what people have done to us. And so when it reaches that point when you got the evidence and you're resistant, who are you having trouble forgiving? And I talked to an atheist at a hotel many years ago. He gave me a blistering attack at Iowa State University. I answered his questions, and he said, "Thank you for answering my questions. I want a 2-hour meeting with you." So we talked for 2 hours, and he came to the point where he said, "I realize the evidence scientifically is more than adequate, but I can't forgive this Christian who offended me some decade ago." And I said, "Look, are you willing to at least allow God to work with you to give you the power to forgive that person? I can understand what he did to you. It was very offensive. But are you willing to let God help you through that bitter experience?" And we need to realize we can ask God to give us the ability to forgive where we don't have it ourselves.
Wow. Okay. When you're talking to other scientists, how do you take this big cosmic God and make him personal?
Well, there's a number of books that have been written by my peers on what's called the anthropic principle, which is this idea that we see all this evidence in the universe, that the universe has been designed expressly for life and especially for human beings. But that's typically where these books stop. And what we do in our books is we say it's not just at the level of the universe as a whole where we see this overwhelming evidence for design, we see it at every size level. Our cluster of galaxies is designed. 200 different features of our Milky Way galaxy reveal design for the benefit of human beings. It's at every size level, all the way down to the fundamental particles. And that's where you can help make it personal. Realize, okay, if every life form on the face of the earth that's ever existed for the past 3.8 billion years fulfills a role in serving the needs of human civilization, then this God must be a personal being. But if they just talk about it at the level of the universe, they can keep God at arm's length. But as you bring it in close, then it's much more challenging to keep it at arm's length.
Wow. Many times I just have to say, wow, or amazing. Noah's Ark. You have any questions about Noah's Ark? How did that take place? Have you ever wondered that? I want to ask him. Noah's Ark. All the animals and...
That's probably one of the... Well, if I've listened to atheists, that's probably one of the biggest things they bring up to ridicule the Bible. Say, this story, it just can't possibly be true. I said, well, have you ever read what the Bible says about the flood? And those might quote Genesis. Do you realize there's a dozen other texts outside of Genesis that also deal with the flood? Have you read those? And what I share with them is, you may think that Genesis teaches that the flood is global in extent, and there's no way you have enough water to cover Mount Everest. But it says what the Bible teaches is a worldwide flood. And they said, well, what's the difference? And I said, well, look what you see in 2 Peter 2. The world of the ungodly was flooded. Or 2 Peter 3, cosmos tote. The world at the time the event took place was flooded. And so Genesis and 2 Peter and the Psalms and Proverbs, they teach a flood that wiped out all of humanity, all the birds and mammals associated with humanity. But because those birds and mammals and humans were living in a locale, God could have a worldwide flood that did not encompass Australia or Antarctica or Greenland. And so It's worldwide to humanity. And keep in mind, when it says, these are the animals that need to go on board the ark, the Hebrew word there is basar. It means soulish animal that's under your relationship and control. So in my model of the flood, there's no polar bears or emperor penguins or kangaroos on Noah's Ark. It's those birds and mammals that were impacted by human beings. The Levitical law tells us that our behavior can cause negative consequences in the birds and mammals under our control. The mean dog syndrome. Mean dogs are owned by mean people.
That's true. And crazy dogs, crazy people. Dr. Ross, speaking of animals, I love fishing. I think it's a biblical sport. And this is really the only scientific experiment I've ever conducted. We have a big aquarium in our lobby area where we have some of our offices. And there were some fish in the aquarium, and one fish was pretty big. It was an Oscar. It's a fish called an Oscar. So I had a little rod and reel, and I put a tiny little lure on it. I mean, tiny, tiny, tiny. And I thought, I wonder if this fish would eat this tiny lure in an aquarium, a controlled environment, etc. So I dangled it in front of him. Boom, he ate it, and I reeled him in an aquarium. Everything splashing, little house we had on the bottom, was turned over. I picked him up. Of course, I never harm fish. I just unhooked him, put him back, and he lived a very healthy life. Well, several months later, I thought, okay, I wonder if this fish remembered the hook and the lure. I took the same little lure, Dr. Ross, dangled it in front of him, and it was during feeding time. He swam away from it. A year later, I did the same thing. He swam away from it. I don't know why I told you that, but I tell my friends I fish with that fish are smarter than I think we think. And I believe when we get to heaven, we're gonna realize that animals are smarter. Tell us a story. You can comment on that, but then I wanna get you to tell the story about how your father had the monkey and the raven. I love that.
Well, I want to know if you ever caught any other fish besides that one in the aquarium.
Well, I have.
Oh, good.
But you think that fish?
Oh no, I definitely would
How
agree.
Smart is that? They're smart.
Well, the other thing I've noticed when you fly fish in a place where it's catch and release.
Yes.
Those fish are smart. They know they're going to get food if they grab the hook and you're going to release them. So they just keep biting to get the food. So they are smart.
Yes. Now tell us the story about your father.
Well, the story I tell in my book, Hidden Treasures, is how Darwin said, the properties of the human mind we get from naturalistic evolution. And, because we're most physically like the chimpanzees and the orangutans, that must be where we got our properties of the mind. And nobody bothered to test that until 5 years ago. 5 years ago, a research group at UCLA and University of California, San Diego, decided to do experiments on chimpanzees and a whole bunch of other animals to see if Darwin was really right that the chimp was the smartest of the animals. And what they discovered is Darwin was wrong. In fact, they titled their research paper, Darwin's Mistake. And what they found is that the smartest of the non-human animals is the raven. And,
the bird.
Yeah, and crows and jays rank smarter than chimpanzees. What they discovered, for example, is a wild raven can recover, this is with no human training, can recover a tool and use that to recover a very different kind of tool and use that second tool to get a food treat. Whereas a chimpanzee can't do that. They can only do it if they've been trained for years by a human being. Now, the other thing that they discovered is that ravens and crows and parrots for that matter show their greatest intellectual capability when they're emotionally bonded to a human being. And yeah, I tell the story of my father who had a pet raven, and he was a machinist. And so he built this large cage for the raven and had a lock on the cage. And the raven would jump inside the cage and then pick the lock and hop out. but would only do it if my dad was watching. Otherwise, he would just ignore the lock. And then my dad would take the lock off and put a second lock on it, a very different one. And the raven would eagerly jump inside the cage, wait for it to be locked so he could pick the lock again. And then my dad actually made these three-dimensional toys like we give to children, where you got like a little ball inside and a bunch of wooden pieces. He made about 20 of those for the raven. And what he noticed was the raven would ignore the toy unless he was being watched by human beings. And then he would solve the toy. They love to show off how smart they are to us human beings. But I think it also teaches a lesson. We human beings have certain capabilities and endowments, but they're not fully manifested unless we're bonded emotionally to a higher being, namely God himself.
Wow. Also, Dr. Ross, you talked about your handicap that you deal with. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm an astronomer, and many astronomers like myself are on the autistic spectrum. I mean, I'm way up on the autistic spectrum. In fact, if it wasn't for my wife there, I wouldn't be able to address this audience. When I first met her, I just stared at the floor with every conversation. She said, you got to look people in the eye once in a while.
You have great eye contact.
Well, it's because of her that I've developed that. And even today, I had to remember, I need to move my eyes because I was staring at one gentleman here. And, probably making him uncomfortable, and I realized, oh no, I got to move my eyes around. So, but that autistic, I can't read emotions, I can't read body language. I struggle with one-to-one relationships, but also because of my autism, I don't realize I've been insulted until 2 hours after the fact. So, it has really helped me in debates. I mean,
helps you in marriage.
Well,
maybe not. No.
Maybe not. Okay. I mean, because I'm autistic, I get a lot of autistic and Asperger's people coming in my Sunday school class.
Yes.
And they all struggle with relationships. In fact, the divorce rate is like 90% for people on the spectrum.
Interesting.
But again, I credit my wife.
Yes.
And actually, I marry people as a pastor, and I tell them, Kathy and I, we have 39 different modes of incompatibility. If it was eHarmony, we would have never gotten together. But we have the one thing that counts, and you see it in Genesis 2. When God brought Eve to Adam, he said, here is your military ally. That's what the word Ezer means, military ally. And you can imagine the two of them sitting there, what do we need military allies for? And God said, just wait, I'm inviting somebody into the garden. That's your enemy. Well, here's the point. If a young gal and a young guy are committed to the battle,
yes,
their marriage is going to last. So if they have that one thing in common, that we're going to stick to the battle,
that's great.
We're going to make it. And by the way, all those modes of incompatibility, Kathy and I are never bored when we talk to one another.
But you said last night, Dr. Ross, all of us have handicaps.
We do. All of us have gifts. I mean, what I discovered is that because of my Asperger's autism, I can integrate material from many different complex areas and put it together into a consistent package.
Wow, yes.
And I used to think everybody could do that. And I realized, no, that's a gift.
No, that's definitely a gift.
But also, I've got handicaps, which means I have to rely on people to help me through those handicaps. And God gives each one of us a special gift that's unique to us, that no one else has, but he also gives each of us handicaps. So we will work together as allies to defeat the enemy.
Wow. Here's another one, and these are coming from our website, from different areas of social media. How did the world populate from the children of Adam and Eve if there was no one else around? I mean, yeah. Well, that's the question.
It tells us in Genesis that Adam and Eve had Cain, Abel, and Seth. And of course, Cain killed Abel, which meant there's only 2 sons, and where are the daughters? Well, if you go to Genesis 5, it says Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters besides Cain, Abel, and Seth. And they lived to be, Adam lived to be 930. he was probably able to have children for at least 600 years, and the best birth control method they had was the rhythm method without the benefit of thermometers. So we calculate that they were having a minimum of one child every 4 years. Now, if every couple is having at least 150 children, then all Cain has to do is wait a few decades before he has lots of gals to choose from for his wife.
Yes.
So I see no question with him finding a wife and populating a city. And however, we do know from Genesis that the population at the time of the flood couldn't have been very high, based on what we see there in the text. And what it tells us in Genesis 6 is that was a time when people were wicked beyond any imagination. And it uses the word shakak, which means that every individual, except for Noah and his family, was bent on malice towards their fellow man, physical harm. So we determined, based on the archaeological evidence, that the murder rate had to be 19 out of 20. And so we actually are living longer on average today than people in the days before the flood. Yes, you had the potential to live 900 years, but most people were dying in their 30s and 40s or earlier by being killed by their fellow man, which is why God had to act. Humanity was in danger of self-extermination. If God didn't act, there'd be no human beings on the face of the earth today.
How do dinosaurs, here's another one, fit into the creation of animals?
Well, the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs for good reason. God inspired the Bible to communicate to all generations. So it only uses vocabulary that all generations would have some idea what it's talking about. Notice the Bible doesn't discuss Homo erectus or Neanderthals. We've only known about those species for the last 150 years. And likewise, it doesn't mention dinosaurs, because we've only known about dinosaurs for 200 years. But where they fit in is between the Cambrian explosion at the beginning of creation, day 5, and God creating birds and mammals towards the end of day 5. So in the middle of day 5 is where the dinosaurs fit. And as every child knows, there's 3 different kinds: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. And what the fossil record tells us is that the Triassic dinosaurs were totally wiped out. And very quickly, you got the Jurassic dinosaurs. And the evolutionary principles tell us that the bigger the body size, the lower the probability for evolutionary advance. So these 3 generations of dinosaurs all give us potent evidence that these animals did not arise by natural means. They had to be specially created. And why did God create them? Same reason he created all life. These dinosaurs played a crucial role in preparing the earthly environment for the entry of human beings. They contributed to the biodeposits, the limestone, the coal, the oil, the natural gas, the concentrated metals that makes it possible for us to leap out of the Stone Age into the kind of civilization and technology you have here in your church.
What an answer. Okay, I love this text right here. This was we just got this one. My name is Isaac. I'm 9 years old. I love God and want to be an astronomer. How can I convince my 14-year-old brother that there is a God on a kid level? Isn't that a good question?
Very good question. And actually in a couple of weeks, I'll be giving a sermon in our church where I'm going to set up a table and it's going to be object lessons. And having done this before, the children get it, the adults struggle. And what I do is show them how big and powerful God is. I mean, physics tells us that the universe has 10 space-time dimensions, and God created those, so he's bigger than that. Now, we can't really imagine these 10 dimensions. You can't really imagine dimensions you don't personally experience. But what I do is I take it down 1 dimension. So I got these cutout figures of Mr. and Mrs. Flat, and I said, notice if you put them on a table, that they only see the outer outline. But as I look at them, I see the interior. God says he knows us better than we know ourselves because he's beyond us. Or how do we understand the Trinity? Well, with Mr. and Mrs. Flat, say on this table, I can put my finger through the plane and all they're going to see is a small circle. But I'm much more than a small circle. But because they only got 2 dimensions of experience, they can't perceive that. I could go to Mrs. Flat and put 3 fingers through that we're playing. She would now argue with her husband. You say Hugh Ross is one circle, I say he's three. What they don't realize is that these fingers are all part of a single three-dimensional closed surface. What does it tell us in the Bible? God is one essence and three persons. And so this is kind of a way you can help children understand how big God is.
Yes.
You know, the most common question I get from 4-year-olds, if God created the universe, who created God? And I said, well, you know, when God created the universe, he created time. And before he created time, he was already putting grace into effect. The hope that we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. Titus 1:2. I also explained to the children, you know, time is that dimension in which you've got causes and effects come after the causes. If God was bringing hope and grace to us before the beginning of time, that means he's moving in 2 dimensions of time. And guess what can happen in 2 dimensions of time? You could have God on a timeline here, infinitely long, that never crosses or touches the timeline of the universe over here. As such, God has no beginning, no ending, and he's uncreated. And I explained to him, you only find that in the Bible. The other holy books don't have that. And the Bible is the only holy book that says that God has access to at least the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time. And guess what? With 2 dimensions of time, he can listen to the prayers of 7 billion people simultaneously and give each one of them individual attention. Now, kids get this. You know why? Because I did some experiments on my sons when they were just a couple of months old. I talked to my wife. She tells you I'm a compulsive experimenter. And what I discovered is they could not tell the difference between a 3-dimensional toy and a 2-dimensional cutout of that toy. That confirmed to me that children are born thinking 2-dimensionally, and it takes several months before they can think 3-dimensionally, which explains to me why 4-year-olds get this much easier than 50-year-olds, because a 50-year-old is in a 49-year rut of thinking 3-dimensionally. Whereas the little children, it's not that long since they transition from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and it's easier for them to make the jump and realize, you know, God is really very big and very powerful, and I can trust him.
Last question. And this one came in, this was kind of an urgent question. This is from Jerry. What is the scientific probability that the Cowboys will win the Super Bowl?
Rather remote.
Yeah, that was
maybe
fun.
Next year.
Yeah, maybe next year. Yeah. Let's again thank Dr. Hugh Ross.